Hello and welcome to Extreme Perspectives. This is a monthly podcast created by the Sense Network to bring you conversations with people who see things differently and think differently. This podcast is for people who want to expand their mind and develop their creative intelligence. I'm your host, Jeremy Brown. For 20 years, I've been seeking out people from the edges of culture, the creators, outliers, misfits, rebels, and the crazy ones. People who want to change things and push the human race forward. In this episode of Extreme Perspectives, I speak with the misfit, author, philosopher, and practitioner of mindfulness, Shamash Aldina. Shamash is an engineer by training, but knew it wasn't the right path for him. He shifted focus to teaching and practical philosophy. His journey led him to become a master of ACT mindfulness. Listen as we discuss the power of community, coping with anxiety, dodging cars, and the wisdom of Bruce Lee. Hi, Shamash.
Oh, hi, Jeremy. How you doing?
I'm very well. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. Very well. Excited to have a conversation with you.
It's for us to talk about. So welcome to the Extreme Perspectives podcast. And as you know, I like to start with a very simple question.
I knew this question was coming. Funnily enough, I actually wanted to call myself a mindfulness misfit, and unfortunately, the domain name was taken and somebody else had named themselves that. So I'd actually reflected on this question years ago, and the reason why was because of one of the things that I spend quite a lot of time is teaching mindfulness, and the way I teach it, and the different aspects I bring to it, and the kind of teachers that we teach, they don't fit the normal mold. And when I reflect on what makes our approach unique, there's all these different bits and elements to it. And so I actually wanted to call our group the Mindfulness Misfits, but somebody else had beat me to it. So I just call myself, just call it Teach Mindfulness. Um, uh, but I guess you probably, and I could guess the next potential question is, what makes me a misfit, or why do I identify with that? Reflecting a little bit deeper earlier on today, ultimately, I do think almost everyone is a misfit. The line is taken from that famous advert, I think it is, come up by Steve Jobs, and he was trying to reach as many people as possible, but reaching many people by using the concept of things like misfits, because people, like this idea of being unique and being different. So ultimately, I think everyone is a misfit, and they all have their unique stories, as I do. In terms of why I feel like a bit of a misfit in the field that I work in, mindfulness, first of all, I actually studied engineering, and I guess I fit a little bit more the mold in that sense. But having tried it as a job, absolutely hated it. I couldn't stand the work that we had to do in an office. In fact, there was a card you had to swipe in and out to see how many hours you'd done. I used to swipe out for lunch so long that I ended up with a negative paycheck at the end of one of the months. So I knew that wasn't fitting into that mold. And then having tried an evening class in the opposite of what I thought chemical engineering was, the opposite of chemical engineering for me was practical philosophy. So having done a class in that, um, I ended up discovering mindfulness and meditation. So, I was the only engineer in the whole year group that said that they were not going to go into engineering or not going into banking, and actually going to go into becoming a school teacher where all the children do meditation. So that, I guess, was a bit of a misfit, but it felt like it was a good fit for me. And I could carry on sharing more stories as we go along, but yeah, I always feel uncomfortable when I feel I have to fit the mold too much, and I feel comfortable in a group of misfits in a way. And so yeah, that's my answer anyway.
Well, hopefully you'll feel comfortable here. There are a few of us. And I think I do agree. Everyone is a misfit in their own way. In fact, I'm probably more alarmed if people think they're not. But and it's a good place to start, because actually these are the features, the attributes, the characteristics that actually define us, and I guess allow us to make friends. Although there's often things that you have in common with people, it's the unique things that we probably enjoy most of all. about each other. It's how we then define ourselves, right? Once we found our groups.
That's true. Yeah, it gives us a sense of identity, doesn't it? It's like, oh, no, this is how I am, a little bit different, or this is what I am into, and then you'll find a certain group that you would connect or click with or not. You find your tribe, I guess, as you'd call it.
Now, I'm intrigued. You talked about, and so after you sort of went from engineering to sort of practical philosophy and mindfulness, did you say you became a teacher and the children were taught meditation?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. The philosophy school that I went to for adults, they had been going on for decades. And back in 1975, they'd started a children's school where all the children learnt the normal subjects, but they also were taught meditation or forms of mindfulness. And the whole school had a silent time or quiet time, I think they called it, at the beginning of the day for 10 minutes and at the end of the day for 10 minutes. And at the beginning and end of every single class for about 30 seconds, there was just a pause. And it was really powerful actually. The quiet time at first, the children are not used to it, but after a while they feel very comfortable in that quiet time. Whether they didn't have to do a particular meditation, they could just do some coloring in or something like that if they want. But about half or more of them did some form of meditation, and the whole school was quiet at the same time. So it's a sense of relief for the children, probably more so for the teachers. Unfortunately, because they had this quiet time, it ended up giving them even more energy because as their mind was calm, they had some time to recharge. I found that the children were quite energetic actually in between.
That's
But
remarkable.
yeah, it was a very interesting school. Yeah.
And what school? Where is it?
It was in Twickenham. It was called St James School, but now I think it's moved further out into Esher, and they have a girls' school, a children's school, and they've got schools all around the world now.
They've got a school in Olympia because I was saying that's interesting because that was a school my children went to
Yes,
that school.
you're joking. St
And
James School.
no, they went to St James School for that very
Wait,
reason. And sorry, I
wow.
shouldn't be telling you. I was going. That's how I haven't heard of another school like this. This is why I was asking, and because the other wonderful thing about that school is they only serve vegetarian food because it's about fresh food, and
That's right.
and I think there was and they I mean there was so many one I mean that's such a brilliant coincidence that we've got that common ground and our paths have never
Yeah.
crossed before. Brilliant. Well, it is one of those. It is quite a remarkable place when you go there, and I think those yes, the quiet time and well, I mean all sorts of wonderful things we can talk about there, including learning Sanskrit, which I think was just brilliant. Because not so much because of the language, because I think what it opens up in their minds about language and understanding and where everything ultimately came from. So, yeah, we were in Thailand and we were with some monks, and the monks were a bit blown away that my young daughter then could read some of the Sanskrit, which I don't think he's ever encountered before. So, in terms of your journey, because I think one of the coolest things I don't know a huge amount about the sort of the journey that you've been on, but one of the things that made me sit up and go, "Oh, that's very cool." You wrote Mindfulness for Dummies,
Yes.
and so that's how long ago did you publish that?
So that was published in 2010, and it's a bit of a funny story behind it, actually. I was I was trying to understand CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. I'd read a few books on it. Didn't make too much sense. So I thought, okay, maybe I'm a dummy. I need to get the dummies book. And I'd never read one of these dummies books before. I thought, okay, let's give it a go. It'll probably be very simplistic. But actually, it was written by a good therapist and it was really well written. So, I was holding this book in my hand and I think I was talking to my brother at the time and it was in America. And he said, yeah, you're always talking about mindfulness, you're teaching mindfulness. There must be a mindfulness for dummies. And so I Googled it at the time and it didn't exist. So I went to the website dummies.com, clicked on contact, and I said, I teach mindfulness, but how come there's no mindfulness for dummies? And I forgot about it. And about a month or two later, they replied to me saying, "Oh, we don't know much about this mindfulness for dummies thing. We'd love to meet you to just tell us what it is." So I had a meeting with these two lovely editors, and they're like, "Wow, this is interesting. We'd like, how about if you were to write the book? What would you include in it?" And one thing led to another, and they ended up giving me a contract like that, just like that, to write the book. And I was a school teacher at the time, but I was also teaching mindfulness, and ended up publishing this book. And it just caught the wave when there was an interest in mindfulness. So they invited me to write four or five more other dummies books on the back of that one, and I ended up, that's when I quit my job as a school teacher in 2010 to teach mindfulness full time.
And since quitting and taking that bet on yourself and going to do something, a departure from that, what journey have you been on since 2010?
Wow, interesting. It was like one of the toughest decisions and one of the best decisions that I made. I remember I had a resignation letter in my pocket, and I was just I was walking to work every day for about 2 months with this resignation letter until the absolute last day, and on the last hour, I put the letter on the head teacher's desk. But it turned out to be one of the best decisions because of, we talked about this idea of being a bit of a misfit earlier on, and there's all sorts of things that you have to do as a teacher and all the rules you need to obey and the structure of the school day, and just being free of that gave just made me feel so much better to start with. So I had a bit more freedom in how I was going to use my time. And although it was tough at the beginning, my income dropped 10x, uh, in the wrong side of 10x, going down 10x rather than up 10x. But I first of all started by teaching mindfulness, and because people had read the book abroad as well as here, I kept being asked to help them to learn how to teach mindfulness. So I did that one to one, and webinars was just a new idea. There was no such thing as Zoom then. But one of my friends said, "Why don't you try teaching in a webinar?" And I said, "That's such a bad idea. You can't teach meditation online. It has to be in person." But he eventually persuaded me, and it was such a pleasant experience. And we had this sense of community that really felt connected with each other, and it was a global community, so you ended up becoming friends with people all over the world. And so I think I was one of the first ones to do that in terms of training mindfulness teachers. And so then that continued up to this day, and that was in, I think, 2012 or 2013, and I do that 3 times a year. And I've continued to do it to this day. So that's not my. I'm into other things linked to mindfulness, which I could talk about, but yeah, that's something that I have continued.
And how many people join you each time? How many people sign up and take part?
Yeah, it varies between about 20 people, and the most we've had is about 50 people in each group.
That's very cool. So, what other things have you got up to involving mindfulness?
Yeah, so after kind of getting into mindfulness, I started to read about related topics. And one thing that I got interested in was the field of psychology called positive psychology, which some of you may have heard of, the science of well-being or the science of happiness. And I ended up meeting up with a friend, and we were trying to brainstorm an idea for how we could reach more people to educate them on some of the findings from positive psychology. And I don't know how the idea came to us, but we thought there's all these different museums, weird and wacky ones. What about museum for happiness? Would that would that work? Does that make sense? And whenever we mentioned the idea or just said the word museum of happiness, it just made people smile straight away, and we thought that was a good sign. But we had no idea how to start a physical museum, or didn't have the funds for it, so we just started doing events, and we did 2 or 3 or 4 in-person events, and we got this nice pattern of mindful activities as well as things like yoga or energizing activities. Laughter yoga was quite a popular one. And then it came to the what is supposed to be, well, what the media call the most depressing day of the year, the third Monday in January. So we thought, let's be the antidote for the most depressing day of the year and make it into a day of positive well-being. And so we did our first pop-up Museum of Happiness in Spitalfields Market, and we were hoping to get our record number, which was 100. But we got really lucky. The post went viral on Facebook, and one minute we had 3 or 4 people coming, and then the next day I checked my phone, and 1 million people had seen that Facebook page, and it had gone to the maximum of 10,000 tickets, either free or donation tickets. And I was like, oh my God. And then even Spitalfields Market started getting worried because of, all the different media from around the world started contacting them. And there's someone who's the Minister of Happiness in Dubai, and she wanted to come over. And it was really, really fun. Ended up on Sky TV and stuff. And we had this amazing event, this 3 days. It was a really magical event. Thousands of people came. And, it was middle of winter. It was snowing. But we had people doing the laughter yoga, and we had a gratitude tree where people could write what they were grateful for. We had like mindful Bollywood dancing, and we had mindful meditations by me, and we had a ball pit where people could jump in, just like an adult ball pit before they were that popular. So we had all these fun activities, and so it became a thing, this Museum of Happiness, and we ended up setting up one physical space and another one, but due to the pandemic and other stuff, we don't have a physical space anymore. And the co-founder I started with, I've passed the project on to her, so she runs it now, and she trains well-being teachers and things like that. So that was one of the side projects that came off from my work, this Museum of Happiness. That was fun. And then the other one that I've got very passionate about is a thing many people haven't heard of, but there's a huge amount of research. It's a thing called ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, or Acceptance and Commitment Training. And just to give you an idea of the level of research on this subject, there's been over 3,000 studies on it since the 1980s. When the World Health Organization was looking for a way to manage stress and resilience globally, they chose ACT as their go-to approach. And Olympic medal winners have used it. Gold medal winners have used the findings from ACT to help them. It's been used in many businesses around the world, and it's considered one of the fastest growing therapies in the world. But it's one of these things where, although it's very rapidly growing and popular in this bubble, the general public don't know about it. But essentially, and it links nicely with your work, it's all about helping to develop what they call psychological flexibility, the ability to focus on what makes your life meaningful and how to cope with the thoughts and feelings and bodily sensations and all the blocks that you have, and the difficult thoughts that come to your head, or the overwhelming emotions, the sadness, the anxiety. How do you deal with all that stuff and yet still focus on how to make your life meaningful? And the reason why I think it connects really well and interestingly with what you do is because one of the concepts from psychological flexibility is cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to ultimately unhook from your thoughts, step back from your thoughts. And the research shows that as you develop cognitive flexibility, as you get less caught up in your thoughts, your creativity goes up. And so psychologists have done these various experiments where they would teach exercises and notice how, when they do certain creativity tests, whatever creativity tests, I can share 1 or 2 examples, but when they do those tests, they find people are more creative and able to think more out of their usual rigid thinking as they become more flexible in a cognitive way. So yeah, so that's the thing that I'm really passionate about now, ACT, and I train people in ACT as well as mindfulness.
This is new to me. I have to say, I hadn't heard of ACT before. So I'd love to hear a little bit more. Could we go a little bit deeper into just sort of what's involved, maybe where you get started, or you were saying, some of the tests you can run, or things like that. I'd love to hear more.
Yeah. So maybe I could just briefly share the story of how ACT got developed. So it was a psychologist called Dr. Stephen Hayes, and it was in the 70s. He was a young psychologist, a young professor, and he saw a couple of professors arguing in his lecture theatre area, and he tried to stop the argument, but suddenly his heart was racing so much. When he tried to stop it, no words came out of his mouth, and he felt really awkward in this moment, but felt very, very anxious. And this what you could call a panic attack or anxiety attack, it just happened again and again. It kept happening. So he started to use all the techniques that were known to psychology at the time, the CBT type exercises, relaxation exercises, But these panic attacks kept coming. He got his students to teach the lectures. He because of he started to feel anxious. Then he used to play videos for so that the students could watch videos, but his hands would be shaking to play the video. It kept increasing. And even when he did a relaxation exercise, he'd be like, just nice and calm now. The actual relaxation exercise would even trigger the panic because it got linked up. And then he had this real moment of low, but also a moment of high, in when he woke up in the middle of the night thinking that he was having a heart attack. So he woke up and he was sweating and his arm was aching and he was convinced that he was having a heart attack. But rather than calling the ambulance, he had this imagery or this image of him calling the ambulance, ending up in hospital, and the person at hospital saying, "This is not a heart attack. This is just a panic attack." And he felt really, really low. He hit rock bottom at that point. But I would say he had a bit of a spiritual awakening in that moment too, because of when he hit that rock bottom, we thought these things can't get any worse than this because it was so painful. He became the observer of his thoughts. He suddenly realized that his thoughts were like a dictator his whole life, telling him what to do and what not to do. And finally, he decided, I'm going to stop running from this dictator within. He became the observer of it. And as soon as he knew in that moment that his whole life has changed, as soon as that awakening happened. But being a psychologist and being a very good scientist, very rigorous, he couldn't just say, you just need to do this and, you have this spiritual awakening. He wanted to know what was happening psychologically. And so he spent decades and decades of research. First of all, creating a theory about language and thoughts and how thoughts and language work, and building and building and building up on that. And because of the way the research has been carried out, the findings from his research or the findings of ACT can be applied in a very creative and open way. But essentially, they found things that intuitively make sense now, but it's got a nice evidence behind it too. So ACT is about being more psychologically flexible, but it can be made up of three different elements. Number one, being present, simple one that people use the word mindfulness. You can also use that, being present. The second one is opening up, so being open to your thoughts and feelings rather than blocking them. Again, intuitively, it makes sense to step back and observe them. This is a real tough one for most of us. And the third element is about taking action that's meaningful, a values-based action. So if you cultivate these three qualities, and there's very creative ways of doing them all, you end up living a more meaningful life. And you need those three together. Now, those three end up being broken down into 6, actually, ultimately. So in 1, it's being more flexible psychologically. In 3, it's about being present, open, and meaningfully engaged. And if you want to really break it down into the 6 separate ones, I'll just quickly say it just for reference for people. Step 1 is acceptance, allowing, making space for our emotions. The second one is called unhooking, which is what helps with the creative stuff, which is unhooking from your thoughts. And there's some really fun ways of doing that. T is a really interesting one. So I'm saying the word T because I'm using an acronym in my head. It's about connecting with your observing self, or you could even call it your transcendent self. But this is not from a hippie, airy-fairy spiritual. This is from hardcore mental health scientific research. If we can connect to that part of us that observes ourselves rather than identifying with our difficulties and challenges, very good for our well-being. Fourth one is being present. Fifth one is about being clear. What are our values? What makes our life enriching? What makes us feel alive? It could be being creative. It could be about being kind. It could be about being curious. It could be about learning new things. It could be connecting with people. Everyone has things that are meaningful for them. So being clear about that is the fifth one. And finally, and this is how it's different from your normal mindfulness courses, it's about action. You need to take action to turn those values into something that is meaningful for you. So what I like about ACT is that it is about taking action, not just about meditating or anything like that, for example. And the way to learn it is also flexible. You can learn it from a book. There's a book called Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, or there's another popular one called The Happiness Trap. You can do courses by those people. You can do courses with me. There's no fixed curriculum that you have to follow, which says then you are an ACT teacher or an ACT practitioner. There'll be some that are better than others, I guess. But they've kept the whole thing open and flexible, and that's why it's kind of grown so quickly.
I'm just reflecting on some of what you've said there, and I'm sort of looking through here and thinking I can recognize a lot of the value in doing these things. Particularly, I enjoyed listening about the clear values and the things that will allow you to do great work. But I wanted to skip back and ask you about step 2, which I think you call the unhooking bit. And you said you had a few examples of how you might be able to unhook. I might be asking for a friend on this one. So,
Yeah. There's some really interesting ones here. So the technical word for this element is called cognitive diffusion, but you can simply think of it as unhooking. What? So one example of this I was just reading earlier is a technique called disobey on purpose. Disobey your mind on purpose. And you can do this if you're listening to this podcast now, if you're not driving, you say in your mind, I cannot wave my arms. You really think that thought really clearly, that I can't move my arms, my arms are fixed. I cannot move my arms. And as you're saying that thought, slowly lift your arms up and move your arms around. I cannot move my arms. I cannot move my arms. I cannot move my arms. Now, as you do that simple exercise, which only takes 30 seconds, what you're doing is creating a disconnect between what your thoughts are saying, or what you could call the dictator is saying, and the action you're actually choosing to do. And they've done some really interesting research on this. So if you do this little activity that I've just shared, like I cannot move my arms, or you just say I cannot walk, I cannot walk, I cannot, and you walk around the room, or you can do it, for anything. You create this diffusion, this unhooking, and then in the experiments they do things like they ask people to place their hands on something hot. It's not going to burn their hands, but it's going to be really hot. And they found when people had done the diffusion exercise, they're able to hold their hand on that hot plate for 40% more. They were less fused with what their thoughts were about what they could achieve or not achieve. Another experiment they did is with little blocks of ice where, one group, they tell them, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it. And they get them to hold some ice for as long as possible. And let's say they could hold it for 30 seconds. The other group, they did this diffusion exercise that I just taught, and then they get them to hold the ice, and they find that they can hold the ice for, I can't remember the exact numbers, but let's say 30 or 40% longer. So by doing this disobeying on purpose, it doesn't seem to be very difficult to do, but you create this disconnect between what your dictator in your mind is saying and what you're actually able to achieve. And so that's kind of one way of freeing yourself up. Another really another unusual technique is when you actually write down your negative thought on a piece of paper. And rather than trying to get rid of that negative thought, you actually put it in your pocket. So if your negative thought is like, I can't give a talk at work. Okay, so I can't give a talk at work, and that keeps going into your head. And you've been trying to get rid of that thought for months or years, stuck there. You take it, you write it on a piece of paper, and you actually put it in your pocket. Now that you may think, hang on a minute, that doesn't seem like you're unhooking to it. It seems like you're kind of stuck with it. But what you're doing is that you are showing your mind that your mind can have whatever thought it wants, but you get to decide what to do rather than the mind. So it's actually an empowering act rather than a disempowering act. The disempowering act is you constantly trying to get rid of these thoughts, and they keep coming back to you. There's that simple experiment where you just say, don't think of flying pink elephants, and the harder you try not to think of it, the more it comes back to you. And it's the same with these difficult thoughts we have. When we try to get rid of them, they come back. But actually putting it on a piece of paper and put it in your pocket, walk around, try it for a few days, look at it sometimes, create that distance between you and the thought, and you choose what to do rather than the thought. And another funny one, this is a really weird one, but it worked for me, is actually singing the thought to a tune like Happy Birthday. So when I looked deeper into my thoughts, there was the thought, I'm not good enough. I found that underlied a lot of my thoughts. So I thought, okay, let me do this unhooking exercise. And one of them is you sing it to a tune of Happy Birthday. So I actually tried it. I thought this is so stupid, but let me try it. I am not good enough. I am not good enough, etc. So I sung it, and it just made me laugh the first time, and then I did it a few more times, and then I noticed that the emotional tone connected to that negative thought had almost disappeared completely. Actually, for some people, the effect isn't so strong, but I found, it's not, it doesn't matter to me so much, and that thought doesn't have the negative emotion that it was strongly held within me beforehand. There's hundreds of exercises like this, and the nice thing is that they've been well tested as well. So there's some examples of ways to unhook from your thoughts.
You mentioned you run a course. So typically, why might someone, or what's going on for someone that might want to come and do a course with you?
Well, I think about half the group tend to be people who want to share this with others, actually. So it tends to be like mindfulness practitioners or teachers or therapists, and they want to learn more about this because, like you, they haven't really heard about it, and they get surprised by the evidence behind it. And they just want, oh, this is really interesting. Let me learn this so I can share this with others. And then there's some people who just feel quite stuck, actually. The beautiful thing about ACT is it can really help people who've been stuck for years. One of the things ACT doesn't focus on is trying to make you feel happier or trying to get rid of your anxiety or your low mood. But 99% of the time, it does have that effect. But sometimes people, let's say if you have anxiety, you've had this anxiety for years, you've tried this therapy, this approach, that approach, but no matter what you do, that anxiety doesn't go away, and you feel like giving up. And then this ACT thing comes along, and it says, you know what? You don't have to get rid of it. It's a feeling. It's an uncomfortable feeling, but it's there for a reason. It's there to teach you something. What if we focus rather than trying to get rid of this thing that you've been trying to get rid of your whole life? What about if we focus on what makes your life enriching, empowering, what makes you feel excited, which you've probably forgotten about because haven't focused on this for such a long time? What about if we think about, remember how you used to play the piano and how much you used to love it? How about if we focus on that, even though it makes you feel anxious? Or how about meeting up with those friends that you used to love meeting up with so much, but you're scared to now? What about if we do that and we learn to make space for this anxiety to be there with that activity? Let's see what happens. Let's give you some skills. Let's, do the card activity or some other activity to deal with the thoughts that you're having. But let's open up to feeling whatever we're feeling. And so finally, after decades, people feel, okay, so I don't need to, there's nothing wrong with me for being anxious or being sad or feeling angry. I can have that feeling and still move forward. And when people do that, they start focusing on the getting rid of stuff. It actually frees them up. It creates some space, breathes some air into their life, and their life starts to expand rather than contract as it may have done for a long time.
Amazing. I hope you don't mind me sharing this. It's a it's a Bruce Lee quote, and at times Bruce Lee I think has some great quotes. You may know this one, but he does say, "Do not ask for an easy life." He said, "Ask for a hard life, but also for the body with which you can withstand it." And I think that's the you know it's those hard things, right? But it's kind of like, yeah, go the long way
Mm,
round, take the difficult path. And sometimes things are thrown at you and you're facing them and you don't really want to deal with them. But in fact, if you can find a way of dealing with them, I can understand what you're saying now about, you know, life starts to expand because you can overcome these things and you just breathe them in and you breathe them out again and you sort of move on. How nice.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I
yeah. That reminds me, that's a great quote, and it reminds me of a quote in ACT, which is very popular as well, which is, "We hurt where we care, and we care where we hurt." And so that place where there is difficulty and pain, the reason it's painful is because if there's something there that matters to us. Social anxiety is a good example. You feel anxious when you connect with others socially. Why? Because you care about what they think about you. You care about relationships. That's why the anxiety comes up there. And so our mind says, oh, the solution is to avoid. Let me try and make my life easier. I just won't meet up with people. But no, then you're getting rid of that part of you which is caring, what you love, what's meaningful, what's linked to your values. And I think that's why probably Bruce Lee links with what Bruce Lee is trying to say there. It's the difficult path is the meaningful path. And as you learn to have the courage to move there with the right strength of body and strength of mind, the openness of mind. I mean, and another one of his quotes is "Be like water, my friend," isn't it? Because one of
It
my
is.
friends recommended one of his books. It's called "Be Like Water." So it's that sense of flexibility, and to have that flexibility to move towards the difficulties rather than being rigid. And I think he'd quite like ACT.
I think you would. Now, I have a a burning question, and I think you're the best qualified person I know who might be able to help me get started on an answer. And I say get started on an answer because I think this is, well, it might be really simple. You might be able to say no or yes, but can you have can can you have too much mindfulness?
Interesting question, which I have almost never been asked that question, so it's a good one. Now, it depends how you define mindfulness. I remember an example of when I overdid mindfulness and I almost got run over. And that was um, when I first learned mindfulness, I tried to be absolutely in the here and now, the present moment. And I was doing that to such an extent that and getting far too carried away that even when I was trying to cross the road, I wasn't able to properly judge distance. Like I could see a car coming over there, but in a few seconds it's going to be right up to me. And also struggling, I remember trying to drive the first week or two when I was going too far with mindfulness and actually forgetting where I was going. I was just driving and being really present and noticing the feeling of my hands on the steering wheel and looking where I'm going, but I actually didn't know where I was going. So um, if you think of mindfulness as just being in the absolute present moment, then I would say that's not helpful in all times. And so that I think you would be getting carried away in it, and it wouldn't be a good idea for your life. If you think of mindfulness as the ability to be flexible with your thoughts, and sorry, to be flexible with your attention. So sometimes you need to be focused and present. Sometimes you need to reflect on the past. Sometimes you need to think about the future. But it's done in a more conscious way rather than in an automatic way. So your mind doesn't constantly go back and forth, past and future, or get hooked to negative thoughts telling you what you can't do or what you can't achieve. So when there's this flexibility of attention, then I don't think you can be too mindful. But if you think of mindful as just rigidly being in the present moment, then I don't think you can really function very much or very easily. There is a time when that is helpful, which is like when you're doing mindfulness meditations to take a break from this constant doing and achieving and planning. Um, but in ACT as well, when ACT talks about mindfulness, it's about this ability to flexibly, fluidly, and voluntarily move your attention. So it's not your attention isn't being grasped by the outer world, but you're choosing where to shine the spotlight of your awareness. And sometimes it needs to be wide and open, and sometimes it needs to be narrow and focused. And that there's parts of the brain that actually manage that, and that's the important bit.
So there was something that I think it was an Alan. I'm quite a fan of the Alan Watts recordings. There are many of them, and they've been labelled all sorts of different things. So you never know if you've heard them all or not. There just seems to be this, and I think that in itself is quite interesting. But the point I was going to make is he sometimes talks about meditation is like medication. You don't need it all the time. There are certain times when you need to use it, and certain times when you just it. If you've done it enough, there are certain things that it just sort of you've got those skills, and I think that's what you were saying. There is just after a certain amount of practice, you have changed some of those pathways. You have changed you react to certain situations. And then there are times then you can almost use it like a, I shouldn't say like a pill, but it's like it's almost like, oh, or a good night's sleep. It's like, no, I need a good night's sleep, or I need to go and spend an hour just to calm everything down. And that's how, as someone who meditated every day for about 3 years and was given a load of statistics on how much I'd um, meditated, which I thought something was very, very wrong with that. And that was partly what was behind my question. Can you stress yourself out by someone else meditating more than you? But actually, that's where I sort of got to, and my own thoughts on this was how you can then start to use it much more tactically as in when you need it, if you've kind of raised the bar overall.
I liked your analogy of sleep. Like, sleep is great, but sleeping all day and all night, all the time is obviously not a good idea. So, there's a right and a wrong time for everything. And just like sleep and just like exercise, you can over exercise, you can certainly oversleep. And potentially, it's an interesting one about over meditation because, if you look at the monks' brains, when they scan them, they have very high levels of well-being. So they don't seem to have done any damage to their brain as such. Whereas with excessive sleep and excessive exercise, I think you can do. But that kind of lifestyle obviously isn't for everyone. And a measured amount of meditation along with our other activities is a good idea. And the other thing that I've seen interesting research on is the value of mind wandering, which is, some people would say, the opposite of mindfulness. But I've seen research is, when you allow your mind to wander and be free and stop controlling it so much, you can actually end up having some nice creative thoughts and ideas. And lots of people talk about how they're having a bath or a shower or going for a walk, and they have this amazing creative idea. And I don't think they were practicing mindfulness as such. They'd actually let go of controlling their mind, and then that idea came to them.
Well, I think there is something very special in going for a walk, or simply just breaking out of your environment and doing something different. But I think walking's a really big one. I Any opportunity to read about people's creative routines. In fact, there's a very good book on sort of authors' creative routines and artists' creative routines, and I mean, I've picked these things up in various different places, but a lot of them, I mean, it sounds like such an obvious thing to say, doesn't it? But so often you can actually forget to go for a walk.
Yeah. Like today, I was stuck. I was stuck on a project, and trying to think about what to do. And I know that if I just carried on spending hours and hours on it, it would probably be mostly wasted time or racking my brain. So yeah, I just went for a walk and a little jog and just doing something different. And I actually consciously said, I think maybe because we were recording this podcast as well, I'm like, I need to come up with a creative solution, but me trying to think of a creative solution is not going to work. Let me just forget it completely, enjoy the sunshine, enjoy the walk, enjoy being present, and let the idea come when it's the right time. I guess incubate is part of that process that's happening there.
Yeah, I often refer to having two processes. There's one you just sort of go, right, I'll just put it back there for a few days somewhere else, and I know something will. You just sort of have to trust yourself that that problem's going to get solved without actually thinking about it. But then I think that's something that I got from meditation as well, because it's not about trying to think through everything and try and figure it out, which is my normal sort of
Yeah.
front brain bit. It's the back brain. It's like, yeah, chuck it over there for a while and see what comes back. And often it just pops out of nowhere, and you don't even realize, it doesn't even really get credit. It's just there on your desk in the morning. You go, wow, that's remarkable. Well, you have to write it on a piece of paper, but that's typically what happens. Yeah, that's a good one. I One of the things that I try to do as well, if I'm walking to the studio, is to try and walk different routes all the time. Never ever look at my phone if I'm out walking, let alone use it, And it has to be look up. I spend a lot of time trying to look up at the tops of buildings and get that different perspective. And I kind of it's just like it's quite a remarkable thing. But that's the streets of London currently.
Yeah, in fact, I read a book recently called Digital Minimalism. and I took up some of the challenges. One of them is to leave your phone behind when you go for a walk. And it's quite hard for me at the beginning because I'm quite used to having my phone to listen to something. But I left it behind, and now I rarely take my phone with me on walks, and it makes a huge difference. If you haven't tried it, if anyone listening hasn't tried it, try it. It just feels like such a relief and a release that you're not expecting, and it naturally generates some mindfulness and creativity that you don't have to actually make an effort to do.
Very good. So thinking about your work and what you're currently doing, is there anything that the Sense Network could do to help you in your work, or is there any perspective that would be helpful to you?
Well, I just love this the idea of cognitive diversity. I'm new to the Sense Network, so I'm just finding out about it. But I see that how you kind of bring people together in different ways, online and in person. And having had the opportunity to be able to connect more in person, I think we all appreciate it a little bit more. So one of the things that I'm going to think about doing is, I'm starting to do this weekly walk in North London. And if anyone's around, we could have this little group of misfits going for a walk together. It could be quite interesting. We might all go in different directions, but at least we'll start in the same place. So that could be fun. Maybe potentially coming together on a walk could be fun. Another interesting idea that popped into my head earlier today is, it's called the Sense Network. So maybe I or a few people could come together and create 3-minute meditations on connecting with your senses. So it'd be almost like a pool of different guided meditations that different people create that are like little mini activities to connect with your senses. I don't know if that's appropriate for the Sense Network, but just using the word sense and connecting with our senses and how that links to my work on mindfulness, that could be a
I,
fun project.
I love that. In fact, it definitely got my synapses firing off when you mentioned that, because sometimes, counterintuitively, you think about, sometimes you have different senses that are dominant, and sometimes it's about taking sort of actually stopping them. I mean, the reason I mentioned this, the story I was thinking about was, we were doing some work on sensories once and trying to get a different perspective on. It was actually to do with feet and soles of shoes. So we were working on a new pair of sneakers, and it was all about feeling and how you could actually get more feeling. And one of the things that we did was work with a blindfold kung fu expert. So that was, I mean, I've trained a lot in kung fu. I did a lot of that, but it was actually getting a design team and an executive team to blindfold themselves, and it's quite remarkable. Obviously there has to be some trust for that to be done, but actually just how the other senses start to spark up um, when you have that deprivation and you take things away. So to think about, meditations based on the senses to try and the different senses, I think that could be a huge amount of fun. I'd love to work on that with you. Yeah, that
That
would
is
be brilliant.
that is a great idea. I love that. I love that. Yeah, the deprivation, it definitely heightens the other senses. I was reading a book called Breath recently, and the guy blocked his nose up for about a week to do. It was to do with breathing. But one of the things that he noticed is when he unblocked his nose, he was almost overwhelmed by the power of the sense of smell that he could pick up, which had been blocked off, and it really made him appreciate that sense that we have available to us.
Amazing. I feel we could have talked for so much longer, and particularly around the deprivation. I was going to sort of. I've got this whole thing about fasting, but I've talked about that before. I went 10 days without eating once.
Wow.
That was pretty remarkable when you start doing that. So I'm going to have to say thank you very much. I feel like I'm going to have to come. We're going to go on a walk.
Yes,
We're going to do that. We'll take a walk around Hampstead Heath.
absolutely, absolutely.
Shamash, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and sharing more about what you do. I'm going to have to go and do some more reading, and I hope this conversation will inspire others to go and expand their minds and read a bit more about ACT as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for your questions and your curiosity. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Extreme Perspectives, brought to you by Sense Worldwide. We'd love you to join this conversation using the hashtag Extreme Perspectives. If you enjoyed it, leave us a review. The Sense Network collaborates with many of the world's most innovative companies to help them be more innovative. Join us at thesensenetwork.com or get in touch via email hello@senseworldwide.com.